Hey, everybody, are you there? This is Reverend Dave Thompson. I'm on YouTube, hopefully. It looks like it got disconnected somehow. So, anyway, we're going live. We're in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13. I just read the passage to give you a brief overview. We talked about Jesus being transfigured, meaning his face was bright and his clothes were bright up on top of a mountain. The three disciples that were with him saw him talking with two other people, Elijah and Moses, and they said, let's set up tents. Then, anyway, God came in the cloud and said to them, this is my beloved son. I'm well pleased in him, and listen to him. And then they go down the mountain, and Jesus says, yeah, Elijah has to come, and he already came. But they did to him what they made him suffer at their hands. And basically, he's talking about John the Baptist. So forgive me for that. Now let's go ahead and jump into the passage and talk a little bit about what this is. I was beginning, and I'm on Facebook as well. This passage was a bit difficult for me. The whole thing is all about this magical sort of transformation of Jesus where he's glowing, where people are appearing from nowhere who have been dead for a long time. And they're talking with him, and the people are saying, hey, what the heck's going on? And then Jesus, stops, and the voice comes from God and all that. That's a lot of magic, right? That's difficult for me to process as a human being because I don't ever observe that right now in today's world. And on top of that, living in the modern age where we know so much more about the universe and so much more about how things work. And we look to the scientific method to discern what is true and what is not, because the whole key and the whole point of the scientific method is proof, to be able to demonstrate measurable proof to each other. This realm, however, because it's 2,000 years old, we don't have that option. We can't look at the YouTube video. We can't see it on Facebook. There's no pictures. The only thing that we have are these documents that were written 2,000 years ago to an ancient society. So what do we do with those? Do we just carte blanche accept them as being absolutely accurate historical accounts? Do we see them as an exaggerated history? Or do we see them as complete fiction meant to be completely symbolic? I think one of the things that's of concern for me as a civil human being and a civil human minister is to respect that in these areas, because we can't prove these things to each other, these have to be left to our own decisions. You and I may agree, and we may also disagree on whether this actually happened or not. For the sake of this conversation today, I'm going to assume that this is a historically accurate account of an ancient people witnessing something that they couldn't explain or understand. And I'm doing that because I think that will help us understand what is being said in this passage. And then in the end, I'll talk a little bit more about this, where we put this whole miraculous thing. But I just want to make sure that you understand that you are welcome here if you disagree with me on whether this actually happened. So let's go ahead and go through this story. So what's interesting here is there are three disciples that Jesus chooses to go with him up to the top of this mountain. We see these three disciples kind of staying with Jesus on some of the more miraculous and some of the more magical experiences. And for lack of a better term, they're sort of his inner circle. They're with him at the Garden of Gethsemane, which we'll get to later on, just before Jesus is crucified. He's having a really hard time facing what he knows he's going to do and how he's going to suffer. So they're there with him there. And these three individuals, it's Peter, James, and John. So Peter is that fisherman. He's that sort of gregarious, outspoken individual. He's the only disciple that we know of being married, and that his wife traveled with him in his ministry. And then there's James and John. They are brothers. So these two come as a pair. And in fact, Jesus gives them the name the Sons of Thunder because they're super passionate and have a huge voice and passion in what they do when it comes to Jesus and when it comes to sharing his message. And in fact, John ends up writing four or five books, and five books actually in the Bible. So he's a considerable contributor to these scriptures that we have right here. They are sons of Zebedee, and Zebedee is probably a fairly wealthy man. He has several servants we know to help with the fishing boats. So it can probably be assumed that James and John came from a fairly affluent family. Not that that is significant, but it certainly helps in some ways knowing, like, hey, they, didn't have to worry about having a job and paying for their bills and all that kind of stuff, which kind of wonder, I'm going to reel this back in and not go down too much of a bunny trail. But how did these disciples live, right? Where did they get the money to eat and all that sort of thing? But anywho, Jesus takes them up to the mountain. And this word transform, it's labeled transfigured. I don't know that that's a really helpful term for today. This term is metamorphosis. It's literally where we get the term metamorphosis from. It's meta and morpheo, which means to basically change, to change as a result of something happening. And what happens? His face starts glowing all of a sudden, and his clothes are bright as the light. In other books and accounts of Jesus, it says they were whiter than anybody could ever bleach them. So it's this idea of being, lit up, as I said in my title today. These specific descriptions, one of them is really important, actually, because it references Moses, who we're actually going to see later in this passage. Moses is one of the foundational people in the Jewish history, is one of the only people. He's the guy who went and saw God with the burning bush. You might remember that. He also was the only person to see God or be in his presence. He gave us the law. The Ten Commandments came from Moses, and much of the Jewish ritual and laws about the temple and sacrifices, that all came from Moses. And when Moses came down from seeing God on the mountain, he came down, and it says that his face was bright and glowing, and he actually had to wear a veil so that people weren't disturbed by it. So when Matthew, who's writing this particular account, talks about that glowing face, I think it is important to note that that's something that those Jewish people who are reading this would have understood to be what happens to a person when they go into the presence of God, whatever that means. They come back and their face is usually glowing. So it's an inference then that Jesus is in the presence of God, is what that essentially means. And even more than that, that he may be God. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So then we have Moses and Elijah who show up, right? These are, like I said, Moses was the one that gave us the law. Elijah was also probably the second most important person in Israel. Elijah was the most prominent of prophets. You remember, those are those teachers that come along and who kind of help keep Israel on the straight and narrow to make sure that they're worshiping the right God in their laws, and that their hearts are right, and they're following these virtues that we're learning as we go through this: compassion, forgiveness, humility, self-restraint, those types of things. The reason why it's important that these are the two people in this passage that show up: Moses symbolizes the laws of Israel, and that is the foundation for how they worship and interact and see themselves as good or bad. The laws about how to remain good, the laws to distinguish what is not good. Elijah represents prophecy, or God sort of speaking through a person, either talking about things to come or talking about the things that are here. Essentially, it means to speak before, is what that prophetes means. That essentially is saying these two things. Jesus represents the law and Moses and everything that the Jewish faith was built on, and also represents everything that's come since then. Those two things, for the people reading this account, were significant because it endorsed the fact that Jesus wasn't throwing out the law or throwing out the history of Israel, but in fact was the fulfillment of it. His whole purpose was to bring Israel back to the virtues of it. Not him as a Messiah or him as a person necessarily, but coming to a place of recognizing that these are the virtues that we as humans are supposed to follow, that work best for us to be happy. Then we have this weird thing, Peter, right? He seems to be this guy who always has to say something. He can't just, let a moment land. He's got to say, hey, we'll build tents for these two guys and yourself, Jesus. And, he's probably just trying to say something. Evidently, Peter's one of these people who, when they're nervous, they talk. And so he's saying these ridiculous things. And then this cloud overtakes them. And this word here, it's a bright cloud. It says it overshadows, which is a little bit, counterintuitive. So why would a bright cloud shadow them? It really could mean encapsulates them or overcomes them. And the idea is that it basically comes over them. So it's possible they're in a cloud at this point. Or I don't know specifically. I wasn't there, of course. But they hear this voice. This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased, my beloved. Listen to him. These words are very, very important to the people, especially reading this, and to our consideration even today, looking at this historical figure of Jesus. This is God signifying that he considers Jesus an offspring. The implication could be that he's saying that this is my particular son in the sense of I have no other sons. This is actually a divine person or being inside this human. And so he's my son. I love him very much. What he's doing makes me happy. So listen to him. So it's this endorsement from God himself, essentially, that he is the Messiah and that he is the one that was supposed to come. And that what he has to say really matters. We'll talk in the end about this because it's quite a statement to acknowledge somebody's being divine. But suffice to say right now, that's what they would understand when they're reading this passage. And then the disciples, they're terrified naturally in this occurrence if this is what's happening. I probably would, throw myself face down as well because I'd be terrified because this is something bigger than any of us. And then we have this weird, interesting thing where they go down the mountain. So they're basically going back to the rest of the disciples. And Jesus makes a point of saying, don't tell anybody. That's a little weird, right? Why would you not want to tell people that? I mean, I would want to tell my fellow disciples and students that, hey, we just saw Jesus who was lit up and talking to these ancient, prophets and the guy who gave us the law, and God told us that he's the Messiah and the Son of God. So it's strange, right? But then he says, don't tell them until, it says in the text, the Son of Man is risen again. And essentially he's saying, till I come back from the dead, which again, pretty miraculous claim, right? But here's the nature of Jesus. And I think this is why it's important for a couple of reasons. One, he's all about humility. He's not about showing off. You remember way back at the beginning of Matthew, we talked about the temptations that he went through when he went out into the wilderness before he started his ministry. The devil said, or the adversary said to him, throw yourself off of this, the temple loft, and the angels will catch you, the Bible says. And he says, don't put the Lord God to the test. So here's Jesus honoring that, but also being somebody who's not all about bragging about his power and what he can do and how showy he is and powerful and mighty. In fact, he tells them, don't say anything. There's an interesting part about that humility as well. What would happen if Jesus were to show himself in that way to everybody at that time? Let's say he just goes around with his face glowing and his, clothes shining bright. Why doesn't he do that? Won't everybody just go ahead and worship him from that point on? They would obviously think that he's supernatural. So why not cut to the chase and get to that point? It seems like a big hole in the story, right, at first. But then you ask yourself the question, would that work? First of all, would people believe it? And if they believed it, would that change anything about them? And if it changed anything about them, how would it change them? And I think the most important point on this that I'm going to kind of leave this conversation with is that when people choose to follow somebody based upon power, it doesn't mean that they're choosing to follow this person based upon what they believe or their virtues. Even today in our leadership, who are so anxious to demonstrate how powerful we are, especially in America as a nation, or to demonstrate how great they are or how big or wonderful, that does nothing for the people, and it does nothing for our ethics, our virtues, our morals as a society, in giving us any ability to learn how to do what we need to. When we have to make the decision to follow someone based solely on their teachings, it gives us the opportunity to, first of all, make a choice of our own free will and accord, but second, to make it based upon reason, to make it based upon evaluating these truths. Is what Jesus teaches a good thing? If we look at it today, right here and now, and look at these humility, compassion, self-restraint, forgiveness, mercy, all of these things, are these good on the whole, or are they bad? For me, that's how I've kind of come to back into the question of faith, is looking at Jesus's teachings and trying to ascertain, even in this study as a human, are these teachings beneficial to me and to others? And as such, if I do think that, then what else does he have to say? What else can I do to help improve myself and society around me to be happy? So I want to talk quickly about the whole miraculous thing. I don't know that it's necessary to acknowledge this as being exactly the way it happened. I think the truths and the concepts behind them are carried across even if they're not. Whether Jesus is God in some fashion, some weird situation where it's a human body being occupied by some advanced life form, I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't observe it. I don't have a problem with it being true. In fact, I kind of hope it is. That's where I place my particular hope. Many of you probably may not do that. Many of you may decide that there is no God, that there is no miraculous, there is no supernatural, and that is up to you, and that is your decision. But if I may, these virtues and these teachings, they are good. They do work because they're laws based upon the realities of the universe. Being compassionate means that people will be compassionate to us. Being humble means that we don't brag and boast because it makes people seethe with anger when you rub it in their face that you're better than them. Being self-restraint and exercising self-restraint when exercising power, that means that we're not going to bully people and we're not going to make people hate us, but they'll see our correction as something that's beneficial for them instead. Last, I just want to say, one quick thing. I love that Jesus tells him not to tell the people that this happened, this miraculous event happened, because I think that it means that people are going to have to evaluate him based upon their reason and based upon what they observe and what the benefits are and what the fruits of it are, and not just because he's powerful or mystical. People have to make up their own minds. And this, today, right now, is one of the most important virtues that we can consider. If in all of this, in all of our faith histories, people are given the choice by God to decide whether they want to be under his control or not. What happens when they die? That's a whole other conversation. But when we're alive, we choose whether we want to fall under the control of these teachings and God, or we do not. If God does that, then we should do that to each other. We should extend, as is one of my core tenets as a civil human minister, we should extend to every person the right to be able to choose who will be in power over them, who will control them. Our vote is a human and a God-demonstrated reality. And I want to encourage you in that as we move forward, that we don't look to fight for power over one another, but we look to empower. one another to be powerful. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to have you. Please leave your comments and suggestions in the comments below because everybody needs to hear your thoughts. You have a unique perspective as a person that is unique in all the universe. You give us a perspective that is important. I want to thank you for all of your support. If you want to reach out to me, please do that on the social medias. I'm Rev Dave Thompson. I'm the same on here. And you can go to my website, revdavethompson.com. My email's there for you. And until we see each other tomorrow live at noon, I want to say to you that I love you. And I hope you choose to love yourself. It's the only love in this world that we have any control over. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving our neighbors the same way. Thank you.